So the final product of research, usually the takeaway and the findings and the research article, prior to setting up the design and conceptualizing what your question is and what type of methods you're going to apply to your question. After all that's done and you have this analysis and research article that you've developed, there's a whole marketplace for research. And so since publishing is online, there's just been a skyrocketing amount of publications and articles about particular topics in academic journals is where they usually are. And so academic journals are publications that sometimes professional associations or academics all organize themselves, and there are people who provide agendas for what the academic journal is focusing on, solicitate, get people to submit abstracts and manuscripts, which are drafts of articles, to these editors, and then they edit them and have this collaborative process of peer review, which then allows these articles to be published in specific journals. And so there historically are journals that have been around longer than others and have esteem and authority because they have been traditionally seen as the knowledge producers in criminal justice. And there's a list of some of them here. These are the big, very popular criminal justice journals. So you have access to this, and we'll get to talking more about how you can access it. But sort of understanding different sectors of this market is there's sort of a sociological approach, which is grounded in grand theory. So defining large questions like social constructs of labeling theory and social disorganization. And so a lot of our theories of crime come from sociology, which is the study of society and people and places, and is very broad. So usually the questions are, what causes crime in the first place? And there's a list of journals that have that framework, that paradigm of understanding and focusing on that specific aspect of experiential reality and of agreement reality. And then there are legal and institutional journals that are more built off of practitioners like judges, and they're usually empirical and descriptive. And so they deal with the institutions themselves because the people who created those journals are from those institutions, and they want research to influence and be applicable to their practices of law. And then shifting further into the more counseling and direct service roles and people who interact with people who have been criminalized by the system is the professional application. So this is usually questions that will more help practitioners. So best practices for therapy, like what types of police interventions work, things like that you can find in journals like the Justice Quarterly and the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. And so they deal with translating criminological research into practice. And the legal and institutional sector also deals, like, in comparison to the professional application, deals more with like government and institutions rather than practices and individuals as much. But obviously there's overlap between all these different approaches, and I'll get into more current trends of the research market. But these three sectors have historically, like when criminology was first developed in the 19th and 20th century, these were the three big sectors. And now we're sort of trending away from the causes of crime due to funding structures. So usually governments fund academics and researchers to analyze specific problems. And because of just how much there's been increase in population and increase in different people who are part of the criminal justice system, whether that be counselors, nonprofits, think tanks, there's this fragmentation that has occurred. So there are those three big sectors, but now there's also people who are in psychology focused on criminal justice practices, people in law who take more of a sociological approach. So there's these specializations that have occurred because there's more and more people in more specialized professional roles. And so sociology journals have increasingly focused on critical and reform-oriented research, whereas like the specialized journals that are more developed by practitioners are funded around political agendas because the government is funding that research to develop best practices. So there's sort of different sectors and focuses, and you can find what sector or focus you are interested in and like really immerse yourself in that world or contribute to it as well. And these are the different intersections. So computer science is becoming way more influential in criminal justice, especially with algorithms and risk assessment scores. Economics is always influencing public policy and has had a real influence on criminal justice policy in particular. There's law, psychology. So there are all of these different intersections and sectors within criminal justice and so many different outlets to write and publish and read different perspectives. And so how are these articles made? I sort of gave you a snapshot preview in the beginning, but usually what happens is that an abstract or a research proposal is submitted to a journal. Sometimes they call for specific topics. Sometimes people just send them manuscripts because they think they might be relevant. And so if a journal is interested, they'll initially say, okay, like submit a draft of the article. And what happens is that a bunch of academics review it that are anonymous, usually, and they provide feedback for criticisms usually on methods, on the topic, whatnot, to make the article stronger. And after that, then the person who submitted gets to revise and resubmit. And so they incorporate the comments that other academics have provided into their edits. And then there's a peer review and then a final product. So usually there's multiple iterations of the revise and resubmit. So sometimes, at least my experience with the one journal article I published is that it took about a year or so to publish it because of the process. There were like multiple processes of revising and resubmitting. So sometimes research can be put out pretty slowly, even if there is a want for it. And so that process is to make it more rigorous, not to create more administrative hurdles in any way. And research is often really important in government and foundations funding services. So usually governments and foundations will put out requests for proposals. So they'll say like, I need a social service provider to provide this specific type of social service with this particular demographic of people, and a ton of different nonprofits and businesses apply to it, and they sort of make their point of why they would be the best provider for that specific intervention or for that specific service. And usually foundations and governments are really trying to find that there's some data backing the proposal's claim. So it's important, even if you're not going into academia and you're so not interested in this process could be a space where you're in, especially if you want to be in like a higher up position within social services or police or corrections. And so it's important to understand how to review literature on the specific intervention that you're focusing on, like if anyone has done experiments or tested the type of therapy you're proposing. If you, as a nonprofit, are collecting data on your clients and their outcomes and can show like very tangibly that the people that you're serving are lives are better because of your contributions to them, then that makes a proposal much better. And also allows you sort of more authority and weight to the claims that you're presenting. And usually in the request for proposal 2, there's like an outline of what exactly the intervention or service is and a budget of what you would need for that. And so there's this quality versus cost balance that has to occur there. And there are different regulations for governments and foundations about like who they pick and the ways and means in which they pick service providers and nonprofits to provide these services. And so getting access to research is really important. Usually research is behind paywalls. And so sometimes if you're working at a nonprofit agency and you know that there's a specific study that supports the intervention you're doing, it might be behind a paywall. And so as students, we serve as a good resource to nonprofits to give them access to that research. And you can access that research just by being a student at libraries.rutgers.edu or scholar.google.com. And I will post a demo on like how specifically to research online through these portals. Another space that's free and nice to go to is annualreviews.org, and it gives you a sense of whatever discipline you're interested in, whether that be law or history or criminal justice, computer science. It tells you sort of the big topics of research and gives you more of a literature review of those topics and what the scholars are talking about in that space. So it might be more easy to understand than it's like a review of the literature done by people who are at the forefront of the literature. So it might be easier to understand than you having to scope out all the articles on a particular topic. It's like someone else has already done that for you. So some helpful tips for when you do review the literature: keep notes about specific articles as you review them. Sometimes beginning with a book or an annual review article on a particular topic can be helpful because it'll provide you a bibliography at the end of like a list of all the authors they've referenced. And so you can skim through that bibliography and say, oh, okay, this particular person's topic, this article, I think it's relevant to what I'm thinking about too. And so that can provide you more resources to look at. Google Scholar is great, and citation management tools, which I'll go over in a demo, is really important because when you're looking at all of these articles and whatnot, it can be a lot of work, you yourself writing out what the citation is and keeping track of it. So luckily there are citation managers that allow you to do that really easily, and I will teach you how to use them. So when you're reading scholarly research, usually there's an abstract which tells you the topic of the article, the type of methods they use, what their conclusions and findings were, what their hypothesis was prior. And so it'll give you everything you need to know about the article so you can determine yourself whether or not you even want to read it. It's sort of like a promotion or a commercial of what the article is. And so usually reading the summary and conclusions after is good because then you get a sense of what the big takeaway is. And skimming the article for what the different visuals are is helpful, because then you can get a sense more visually of what's going on, and then carefully reading the entire article. Um, and reading the entire article can seem, especially the methods section, can seem very overwhelming. But as long as you have a general understanding of methods from this course, it should be less overwhelming. And you can point to like, oh, they used an experiment in this specific instance because they were looking at the cause of something rather than trying to explore something. And that's what you'll come away with in this course. And reading scholarly books, usually you read the preface or the introduction, and in the preface or introduction, it'll have at the end of it usually a roadmap of everything that the book's going to talk about and the takeaways as well. So when you read through the preface, sometimes you can say, oh, okay, I really want to read chapter 5 because it talked about this specific thing that I'm interested in, whereas the other chapters are sort of relevant, but not so much. And so it allows you a space to find what you can take away with. And just a note, finding books via rutgers.library.edu is much easier than going to Google Scholar sometimes, because we as students get online access to a lot of books as well as physical copies. And then finally, the research proposal format of research is what is used to assess whether or not editors of journals want to include an article, or if there's a government agency that wants specific research, they might also call for a research proposal. And so you all are not going to do a research proposal in this class, but you may do it like for your dissertation, or if you want to get more into academia, it is going to be something that you really need to be familiar with. But just generally, usually there's a problem or objective, and then a literature review of like what has already been studied on that topic, who's already talked about it, what they've said, what your specific hypothesis is, what your research design is, so your subjects of study, your measurement, data collections, and then what you analyze. And remember, we're keeping the observations separate than the research design, because there needs to be some way of validating them without us influencing the outcomes. And more administratively, there will be a schedule and a budget for you to get this research done by. And so this is how research is funded, and whether or not it is dependent on like how well your research proposal is and whether or not it's a good fit for the place you're applying to.